Hi there. This is part of a series of thematic videos I've been making about the world of A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, and House of the Dragon. Things like food in Westeros, heraldry in Westeros, weather things. I wasn't planning on making this one, but it came up. Cats. Talking about cats in the story. They don't come up that much, but the specific examples and then generally, and actually I thought of something that kind of is relevant to House of the Dragon if you read through Fire and Blood and what it says about cats. Stick with me on this. I didn't plan on making this, but who doesn't like cats? To start with, the specific major cats in the story, there aren't that many. A prominent one, and this is only in the novels, they cut it from the show, is that Rhaegar Targaryen's first child with Elia Martell was named Rhaenys. She was the third Rhaenys after a couple of historical ones. This is Princess Rhaenys, daughter of Rhaegar, his first child, and thus Jon Snow's older half-sister. She died when she was only 3 years old during the Lannister sack of King's Landing. But before that, it mentioned since the first novel that she had a black kitten that she named Balerion, after Balerion the Black Dread, the greatest Targaryen dragon who ever lived. And she liked to pretend that her kitten was the real Balerion the Black Dread. She'd pretend, hey, oh no, it's Balerion the dragon coming. So her cat, Balerion, was this cute kitten. And she got killed in the sack of King's Landing, Rhaenys, but they never found the cat. And it's sort of implied that 15 years later, in the books it's 15 years later, there's this old cat, this old grumpy cat that stalks the Red Keep who has one ear from battle damage. And they imply that that is Balerion. That is Rhaenys Targaryen's, Jon Snow's older half-sister's cat. And he hates the Lannisters because of that. That as part of her training with Syrio Forel, Arya was ordered to chase down and catch every cat in the Red Keep. You do see that in Season 1 of Game of Thrones, that she's stalking cats to learn how to be sneaky. And in the book it says she succeeded with all of them except for the one mean older black cat, this tomcat. But when she finally does manage to catch him, he tries to claw her, and instead she kisses him on the head. So the Starks are nice to the cat, so the cat is nice to her. Later, Sansa sees the cat, and it runs away when it sees her in the Godswood. But it's this thing that it hates the Lannisters because of what they did. This is what one of the Gold Cloaks says to Arya in the books about describing the cat and why it hates Tywin. That's the real king of this castle right there, older than sin and twice as mean. One time, the king, Robert, was feasting the queen's father, Tywin, and that black bastard hopped up on the table and snatched a roast quail right out of Lord Tywin's fingers. Robert laughed so hard he was like to burst. You stay away from that one. Now, in the books, it's Marjorie Tyrell who gifts Tommen not one but 3 black kittens. Sir Pounce is one of them, but there's Sir Pounce, Lady Whiskers, and Boots. TV show only had Sir Pounce, and he was already Tommen's cat, as opposed to being a gift or something. They barely used him on screen. He was in one episode. I actually completely sympathize with that, because cats are notoriously hard to work with in the film industry. I mean, you've probably heard the expression, never work with very small children or with animals. That's very true for just actor wolves. I mean, all the problems they had dealing with actor wolves, or even an actor bear, they had to work under very controlled circumstances to get a bear in one episode. Briefly, and if you actually rewatch it, it's movie level dealing with an actor bear, but the amount of, they had to have green screen, he wasn't even on set, working in an actor bear. Dogs are hard to work with. Horses Oh god, the horse stuff. I mean, you can get thrown by a horse for no reason just because something it spooks it. But cats are probably the worst thing that you have to work with on film. And I've heard this for other TV shows I followed. The one complaining about, damn it, that one scene with a cat just would not work. There's no such thing as an actor cat. You know, you point the camera at the cat, you can't make it do things. It won't jump off of a bed on cue. You're lucky if you can film it while it's curled up sleeping somewhere. You can't get it to leap on a bed on cue. That's crazy. Cats don't train like that. It's very hard, particularly when you're on a limited schedule. So they had Sir Pounce in one episode, and I've seen this in other shows before, that you're expecting it. In the DVD commentary, they're all complaining, damn it, it took so long to film what was a simple scene, because that cat just would not do what he was told for that one scene. And, well, then mention the cat in dialogue, or have a brief shot looking at it, but don't, like, expect it to run around doing tricks. Any cat owner could tell you that. Just like the book, like, have a guardsman describe what a cat did. He stole a quail out of Lord Tywin's hands. Don't, like, try to imagine if they actually tried to film that. You could never film that with a live cat. Maybe CGI, but that's crazy. So that's what's going on with, we had Balerion and then Sir Pounce. Balerion actually met Sir Pounce in the books. That they mention in, I think it was the last book, most recent one. Yeah, 5th book. Tommen mentions that the old one-eared black cat showed up in his window, but Sir Pounce hissed at him and he went away. So they've met each other. Moving along, probably the biggest cat thing in the books is with Arya, of course. That, you know, a lot of cats named Arya these days because of the show, that she chases cats in the first book, but particularly in Braavos, and they basically cut all of this from the show, that when she becomes the oyster girl, her disguise is the oyster girl selling oysters, clams, and cockles, it states there are a lot of cats in Braavos. Because, I think it's because it's a big fishing town. That because there's so much fishing on the docks, it would attract a lot of vermin, so they have a lot of cats to deal with anything that might be attacking their stuff or something. But it's one of those, it's loosely inspired by a mix of Venice and Bruges, but they say there's just packs of cats running around, and the people tolerate them because, you know, they get rid of vermin and stuff. So when she's being the oyster girl, she actually takes on the name Cat. The chapter thing is she's the cat of the canals. And it mentions, quote, some days she would have a dozen cats trailing after her before the sun went down. There's like this this pack of cats just following her through Braavos. From time to time, the girl would throw an oyster at them and watch to see who came away with it. And the biggest toms seldom win. Oft as not, the prize went to some smaller, quicker animal. I've noticed that with most cats when I've had groups, that the larger ones actually tend to be more docile, because the smaller ones need to be more aggressive to compete. That you don't need to be aggressive when you're a big cat, you're a gentle giant. That it's the size of the fight in the cat is what happens. So her favorite was a scrawny old Tom with a chewed ear who reminded her of that one she saw back at the Red Keep, which was Balerion. And this actually plays a part in it. I'm annoyed that show cut this. There's so many things they cut by the end and eventually truncated the show. This isn't like a little complaint. It's they weren't trying to adapt the books. But they never mention that all of the Stark children are wargs to varying degrees. For that matter, they messed up that it's actually called skin changing in the books when you enter the mind of an animal. That wargs are a subset of skin changers who specialize in wolves. Though, to be honest, it's more of a preference. If you prefer going in wolves, you're called a warg, but you could plausibly go into any animal. Like Varamir Sixskins has control of a couple of wolves and a bear and a panther, so it's not like... Warg is what they call someone who happens to be doing a wolf at the moment. It's really skin changing. And it's powerful in people who descend from the blood of the First Men. It's First Men magic, ancient magic from the Children of the Forest. and it's strong in the Stark bloodline. Bran is really strong with it, but he's not the only one. That when Jon Snow meets the wildlings in the second book, they explain, you're a ward, you have this latent connection to your wolf. And by the fifth book, he is consciously aware of it. He can't control it yet, but he understands that when he's having wolf dreams, it starts as dreams, he understands that was real. My mind was going into my wolf uncontrollably. And they say you'll eventually get good enough at it to control it consciously. But the other one is Arya. Arya is also a skin changer. And she has wolf dreams about Nymeria, who's a continent away at this point. But another thing is, she skin changes into cats in Braavos. And that's actually how she passes the test with the kindly man in the House of Black and White with the faceless men. That it's supposed to be a test of, she's taken the drug that leaves her temporarily blind to focus on honing her other senses. And she's supposed to guess just from smell and hearing who is hitting you. It was the kindly man himself. And they're really impressed with this, of, wow, you figured out it was me and not just an acolyte who was hitting you. And then the way the chapter ends, you realize it doesn't state this like, I skin changed into the cat, but the way it's phrased, it's cats aren't fooled by this, that she didn't point out to him that there was a cat in the rafters that followed her back, and she had skin changed into the cat's mind so she could see through the cat's eyes to see what was happening. And she changes her appearance a couple of times, shape-shifting, that when she's Cat of the Canals, the pack of a dozen cats is following her all over the place. When they have her be the begging blind girl, she looks physically different because of the shape-shifting stuff. She realizes the cats can still recognize me by smell, that the cats know that she's Cat of the Canals, the oyster girl. And one follows her back to the House of Black and White, and she skin changes into it in the rafters to pass the senses test. She doesn't tell them I was actually seeing through my kind of magic versus your kind of magic, which is really interesting. They didn't get into that just how much Arya is associated with cats in the books and with Braavos. And they really it's so weird how people were still so obsessed with Arya going into even season 8 when she hadn't had a good storyline in years. It's weird that people hated her season 6 storyline with the waif chase and going, this is so implausible. She was stabbed are we going to have this thing where she amazingly skin changes into a cat to pass the blindness test? No, we're going to have the biggest, they kept hyping it as the biggest foot chase in TV history, and impressing us with this scale. And it was supposed to be bigger in the film, in the script. I have a bigger video explaining this. She was going to be doing somersaults and stuff, and Maisie Williams had to tell them, Arya just got stabbed. Why? It's even ridiculous she's doing a chase, much less doing somersaults. This is absurd. And there's a theory that there was a deleted storyline. I honestly have no idea. That even if this is what they intended, it was ridiculous. That they're capable of doing something that stupid. It could have been this cool thing with blind Arya seeing through a cat to land a killing blow on the waif. Instead, it's just, let's have this implausible foot chase that left everyone really annoyed. Then season 7, we had a really annoying Arya plot with Littlefinger. But even going into season 8, the cult of badass Arya was still in force. I don't know why. Maybe because the Frey killing was halfway decent. And then I guess you got what you deserved if you were still on board with the cult of badass Arya as opposed to Arya as a skin changer who can go into cats. No, it's just this stereotype, and you got them overusing her so much in season 8, but this isn't about Arya, this is about cats. Okay, that thematic thing they were building up with her and cats that really drifted off into nothing. And I wanted to see that. I was waiting for her to skin change into cats. I was, for that matter, waiting for Jon Snow to explain I am having wolf dreams. But we didn't get that. So, the cats that we actually saw in the storyline, that's all. We have Rhaenys's old cat, Balerion, the old Targaryen cat, who is still in the Red Keep as of the end of Book 5, because him and Sir Pounce hissed at each other, and there's Sir Pounce and the other kitties. And there's all the cats in Braavos, and Arya and her thematic link to cats. Those are cats that are individual cats in the storyline. But this is all just set up for the world-building element I wanted to get to, and this is actually important. That I was doing other things in other videos talking about, like, when you read Fire and Blood, like, what was their society like at this specific point in time leading up to the Dance of the Dragons? The ripple effects of there has been a full century of peace under the Targaryens, that it says we have never had peace for this long. Even if you count everything through the Faith Militant Uprising, like Jaehaerys' reign was 55 years long and peaceful. And they've never had the Seven Kingdoms at peace like that for so long. And there were social ripple effects from that. It says, between the conquest and the end of Jaehaerys' reign, so by the start of the TV series House of the Dragon, in the past 100 years since the conquest, the population of the entire continent has doubled. Like, King's Landing wasn't there before. There's this whole new city. On top of that, just everywhere, they said a lot of the countryside used to be just wilderness. There's a lot more towns than there used to be. It's not just King's Landing, that the population has doubled because of all of this peace. And I mentioned this way back in my review I posted a generalized review of the first half of Fire and Blood before we get to the Dance of the Dragon stuff, mostly all the new chapters about Jaehaerys' reign. And little things it talks about of, like, cultural effects of being at peace for that long, that the highway system never existed before, that they built those. And one little thing that, if you remember, this is like 2 years ago, I really fixated on it. There's this little note that fish used to only be seen as a food of the wealthy because there were so many ironborn raiders, attacking all the ocean-going fishermen ships, that it was expensive to get ocean fish. And I'm talking about this as someone who's tried to cook things from A Feast of Ice and Fire fan cookbook, which has been blessed by, George R. R. Martin wrote a foreword to it. But a lot of the dishes in that have fish are river fish, because we couldn't get ocean fish because they're expensive, because there's too many pirates. Well, it says, there's this, it's a short, paragraph, and in the book there's this throwaway mention that fish used to be just, for centuries, since the dawn of time, it was a food of the wealthy, because it's so hard to get. Then the Targaryens brought the Ironborn to heel and shut down all the coastal raiding. And because of that, only in the past 200 to 300 years have ocean-going fish become something that normal people, regular people, could afford. So it's this thing that there's a cultural holdout that people still think of fish as something to be excited about, even though it's not that expensive anymore. And I mean, think about, your grandparents, who lived through World War II, who lived through rationing. Did they ever get really excited about foods that you're like, we have that all the time now, like candy? We didn't used to have this much processed sugar candy all over the place, or coffee, just things that were in short supply in the war years when they were children, or as immigrants. And just, or if your parents came over as immigrants more recently than that, but you've moved up the social ladder of grandparents who are really impressed with food that you consider cheap now, that was a delicacy to them back at the time. I remember my grandfather was, my mom doesn't like the giblets that come with Thanksgiving turkey, like the neck meat and all the organ stuff, and she will throw it in the trash. And when my grandfather was still alive, he'd get angry about that, going, how can you throw out food? You make it into broth or something. Don't just throw out the turkey neck meat or something, because he grew up in the Great Depression. That's absurd to throw out meat when you grow up in that mentality. So the things like that of just people in Westeros, even by the War of the Five Kings, have this social bias that they should get really excited about. We're having cod, it's ocean fish, it's a food of the wealthy, even though it's really not that expensive anymore. Because for thousands of years it was really expensive, and they lived through, just as an ingrained cultural bias, Ironborn raids made fish expensive. So, or chocolate was the other one I wanted to think of. People who lived through World War II rationing, who got really excited whenever there was chocolate. And when I was a kid, we had rationing, there was no chocolate. You get excited about things. So, what were the other effects, ripple effects, about, and this ties back to cats, about having peace for this long? That the Seven Kingdoms had never been united before. Well, under the long peace of Jaehaerys, which lasted over 50 years, he started building lots of highways. Like the King's Road didn't exist before. Suddenly, the population mushroomed in size. It had doubled. And they had all of these highways, and sea travel on top of that was really safe because the Ironborn were gone. So on land and sea, there was more trade than there ever was. There were no hostile internal borders. The people were just traveling along highways from Old Town to King's Landing to Winterfell to Lannisport. There was so much travel and so much trade. And a ripple effect of that was, for the first time, they started getting really big epidemics. And I talk about this when the coronavirus pandemic first started back April 2020 was when we went into, well, March. April was when it got really bad. Back in March 2020, I made just to try to remain calm, I made a series of videos about epidemics and plagues in Westeros, and this is where I broke down all of that. The ripple effect of there being peace for so long was you get the sense that there weren't plagues like this on a continent-wide scale before the Targaryen peace, simply because they'd never had that much free travel before. And it's not something to blame the Targaryens for. I point out they eventually got better at handling it. That there have been 3 major plagues since the Targaryens came to power that were widespread, not just in one city. The first and most devastating of these was the Shivers Plague that happened about 10 years into Jaehaerys' rule in the year 60 after conquest. This is 40 years before House of the Dragon starts with the Great Council. There was this devastating plague that swept all of the Seven Kingdoms. But the next 2 they handled a little better. That there was the winter fever, was mostly in the north and east. It never got to Old Town or Lannisport, and we would see that in like season 8 of House of the Dragon or season 1 of a sequel series about the Regency that directly followed it. But epidemics will come up in this story in much later seasons. Like a sequel show to this, it would be in the first season that so many troops are moving around because of the war that a plague spread, the winter fever. But it wasn't that bad across all of Westeros. It devastated King's Landing in the north, but they said it mostly hit places where it's cold. Then the other really big one that a lot of you will remember, because it's from the first prequel ever written, the Dunk and Egg prequels, is the Great Spring Sickness, which was worse than the winter fever, was as bad as the shivers almost. And that was chronologically the last one. That was about 90 years-ish before the War of the Five Kings. It happens between the first and second Dunk and Egg novellas. It happens off-screen. But like I said, the Targaryens, it's not, the Targaryen peace brought plagues. They had to adapt to, we've never had peace like this before because it was unprecedented. They got better at it as they went along, that by the time of the third plague, they had better quarantine procedures in place. That the Vale shut down its borders. Dorne shut down its borders, and they explained Dunk and Egg survived the plague because they were in Dorne at the time. So it didn't sweep all of the Seven Kingdoms because 2 of them figured out we need to strictly quarantine all travel, and it worked. But it was bad everywhere that didn't quarantine in time. King's Landing was devastated. So the point is, one of the ripple effects of there being unprecedented travel and trade and population boom is they started having bigger plagues. Not started, it was 3 separate plagues over 200 years. But point is, think about it. House of the Dragon, 40 years ago, there was a massive plague, the Shivers, that gutted the kingdoms. And it took them like a decade or 2 to recover. It was pretty bad. And Jaehaerys handled it well. It's a natural disaster. What is he going to do? But think about, like I was talking about, the biases your grandparents have because they lived through World War II. They lived through chocolate rationing, and they're obsessed with chocolate. Wow, that's such a treat. It's cheap now. Well, I lived through rationing. All of the older characters in this, elderly people like Harold Westerling or the Grand Maester, lived through a massive plague. They lived through a big epidemic. And imagine the psychological impact that has on people. I keep wondering about, like, people who are children now, like 5-year-olds to 10-year-olds who lived through the coronavirus and is really scary when you're a child more than when you're an adult. What will our children's generation, and my nieces and nephews, how will this affect them in 30 years in terms of their psychology? And I hope it doesn't, traumatize them that much. It's scary. It's not like a war actively outside their door, but it's still scary. As a child, a 3-year-old, it's really scary because they don't even comprehend it. That imagine, I'm thinking of when they talk about the psychological effect on people growing up during the coronavirus as small children. What must have been like for older characters who lived through the shivers? And of course, there's time skips in season 1 across the scale of 30 years. That season 1 will start at the beginning of Viserys' reign, which is 40 years after the Shivers Plague, and it'll conclude at the end of Viserys' reign 30 years later. So the bulk of this TV show is 70 years after the plague. But okay, most of season 1, some of the older characters. The Shivers is within living memory for old people. Who would that really affect? Well, it affected the parents of some of the adult characters in this. The father of Viserys and Daemon, Matt Smith, their father, Balon, I looked this up, he was 3 years old when the Shivers Plague hit. So their father would have been affected, psychologically by the plague. Or Harold Westerling, they're changing around a bit for the TV show. He'll live longer, but clearly presenting as an older man, was probably a child when this happened. Probably biggest example is actually Corlys Velaryon. I looked it up. Corlys was 7 years old when the Shivers Plague hit. I mean, he would very clearly remember this. It's not just, oh, my father was 3 when this happened. Corlys is a grandfather by the time of the main part of the series. Corlys was a child, 7 years old enough to remember the Shivers Plague gutting Westeros. And how does that affect a person? I mean, with like children like my nieces and nephews now, I wonder 20 years from now, will they still be uncomfortable shaking hands with strangers? Just people used to shake hands all the time, and I'm not a person who likes shaking hands. I was already a germaphobe before the pandemic, but that people don't shake hands anymore. I wonder if that's going to fade over time. I mean, how did the 1918 flu pandemic after World War I probably put an end to a lot of handshaking for a while, but eventually came back? Or will my nieces and nephews 20 years from now still be wary about going about in public without a mask because they have to do that in school, or shaking hands with people? I don't know, because on the other hand, Westeros doesn't quite have a germ theory of disease, but they know it's from contact with sick people, so hard to say. But the effect of some of the really older characters like Corlys or Harold Westerling, or children of people who grew up during this plague, like Daemon and Viserys' father was a small child in the aftermath of that. What were some of the results of the Shivers on a societal, ripple effects of that there was this big uber plague within living memory? Well, there's this great quote here. Quote, many of the small folk believed that it was carried by rats, that the Shivers Plague was carried by rats, and not the typical gray rats you see in cities like King's Landing and Old Town, the big, bold, and vicious rats. We're talking that type of smaller black rat that manages to sneak on board ships. They're mouse-sized. The black rats that spread on ships and then come swarming down the rope lines on when they're at dock, and scurrying down the ropes that hold them fast. Though the guilt of the rats was never proved to the satisfaction of the Citadel, everyone believed it was the rats. It probably was. And suddenly, every house in the Seven Kingdoms, from the grandest castle to the humblest hut, required a cat. Before the Shivers ran its course that winter, kittens were selling for as much as destriers, war horses. So you see where I've been going with all this, that just as children living through the coronavirus pandemic now, like 20 years from now, might be obsessed with Purelling their hands, using alcohol, Purell, wiping their hands with germ stuff. They didn't have Purell and stuff or a germ theory of disease in the Middle Ages or in Westeros. What they did know, what they could be obsessed with as a preventative measure, was we think plagues are spread by rats, from the fleas from rats. So, whereas people now would grow up being obsessed with don't shake hands, Purell your hands, wear a mask. People who grew up in the aftermath of the shivers, which would have affected people even 10 years later, they'd still be really obsessed with get rid of the rats and stuff. Instead of Purell, they'd be obsessed with cats as a preventative measure against plague rats. So just reading through Fire and Blood, you wonder, what is it like culturally? The little things like suddenly fish became very cheap and were something common people could afford, so they'd eat it to feel fancy because it used to be expensive, even though it wasn't anymore. Maybe older characters in House of the Dragon are really obsessed with cats because they lived through a plague. Just as a little story element, I think that might be nice. No, I'm serious. Something like Corlys Velaryon, because he was 7 when it happened, he would clearly remember the Shivers Plague. Something like he has a lot of cats around his study or around his castle, and just you'll see him absent-mindedly, patting a cat. The mental image I have when I think of Corlys patting a cat or something is the Godfather movies. Like Marlon Brando in his study just happens to be, patting a passing cat on the head. He likes cats. What? And he's, conducting business and stuff, and just in his expensive, well-furnished study, and just he has cats who have free run of the place. Little things like that, or maybe even show the generational divide by like having the grandchildren of people who lived through it, comment on, you guys are so obsessed with cats. Like, have Bela or Rhaena chide their grandfather, you dote on your cat so much, and him go, you'd love cats too if you lived through a plague, like I did, and these things saved us from the plague rats. Or maybe Harold Westerling talking to his niece, Joanna Westerling, who marries Lord Lannister. She hasn't been cast yet, but she should be in the show. Or Daemon himself. Maybe Daemon doesn't like cats because he thought it was annoying that his father was obsessed with cats because of the plague, and to show a generational difference. The older generation likes them. Maybe the younger people would at best not understand it, or maybe even resent it. I don't know, but just people who lived or grew up in the aftermath of the Shivers Plague would probably be obsessed with cats. That was within living memory for the older characters. And I think that would be a nice story building element for House of the Dragon. Not a huge thing, just like mention in passing, like have a thing where someone's petting a cat and going, wow. Or maybe this is something they'll at least mention in the Histories and Lore animated feature, as one of the big things that's background for House of the Dragon is the reign of Jaehaerys. So he'll talk about the Shivers Plague, and cats are amazing and stuff. So all the cats we know about from this are from the main novels, not the prequels. We don't have like named cats from the time period of the Dance of the Dragons, but on a broad level, these are people who love cats. They lived through a plague. Cats were selling for as much as war horses because they get rid of the plague rats. We'll probably see something like that during the Winter Fever. Just have like when the Winter Fever happens, like again, like either season 8 of this show or season 1 of a direct sequel about the Regency era. When the Winter Fever hits, like show a marketplace where people are buying kittens for as much as a warhorse. That'll be amazing. Because cats are great. They're vermin exterminators. That's why they were originally semi-domesticated. Was ancient people brought them in to deal with rats and mice and other vermin, and gradually realized, wow, these things make such amazing pets because they're so quirky and intelligent. And people go, oh, cats aren't friendly. If a cat isn't just a dumb pack animal or herd animal, they're quirky, they are affectionate, and if you win the love of a cat, you have a friend for life. And if you haven't had a cat, you wouldn't understand it. That just, they know what's going on, they do their own thing. I often compare dragons to cats in the whole dragons do their own thing. That no, really, that like dogs and herd animals like horses have been fully domesticated. Cats are only semi-domesticated. It's a better way to understand. Like there's points in the books where riders can bond with dragons, but they're never fully tamed. They keep saying, "Who knows the mind of a dragon?" Sometimes they'll have a homing instinct to go back home and find their rider. Sometimes they do quirky things. Sometimes they start getting a shared personality with the person they bond with, and who's reflecting who, it's not clear, but it's like that where they're not entirely tame, but they will bond with you, and that's this really mysterious bond, like with a cat or with a dragon, that when you're dealing with an animal, it's only semi-domesticated. And it's almost that instead of just blind obedience, that this is a friend. And on both sides of the Civil War, like, it's not just, oh, Rhaenyra's side is good, they care about the dragons. Like, Aegon II really cares about his dragon, Sunfire. He is his friend. That he cries when he gets hurt, and that's a pretty good analogy for that. Well, it's like having a cat, but they're your friend. They never do exactly what you want, but they're always there when you need them. So that's my thoughts on this. I didn't plan on making this video about cats in Westeros, and just some ideas. It's world building, how you can put cats into this. It's about cats.